Hello viewers, today let's look into the different elements of nationalism that were depicted through the Tagore's most famous novel titled Gora. It gives a powerful psychological definition of nationalism in which that ideology becomes a defense against recognizing the permeability of the boundaries of oneself, a piousness that the cultures in his part of the world sanction. He in effect argues that the idea of nationalism is intrinsically non-Indian or anti-Indian, an offense against Indian civilization and its principles of religious and cultural plurality. Three of his novels called Gora, which was written in 1909, Ghare Baire in 1916 and Char Adhyay in 1934 were seen as direct attacks on hard-edged masculine nationalism. Nationalism is an ideology. It can be defined as an identifiable pattern of attitudes, beliefs, values and needs in human personality. Even those who use the term nationalism without caring about its ideological contents end up imbibing some of its essence. This is because they have to constantly interact with those who carry the ideological baggage of nationalism and are affected by such agreeable validation. Nationalism thus is a more specific, ideologically tinged, ardent form of love of one's own kind that is essentially ego defensive and overlies some degree of fearful dislike or positive hostility to the outsiders. The feeling of nationalism and colonialism is described in many aspects and is a vital role in the plot. Unlike the common perception of colonialism as economic and political exploitation, a colony is also affected culturally, religiously and psychologically, which is crystal clear when looked upon the colony of the Indian subcontinent. Gora is set in Kolkata in the second half of the 19th century and focuses on the generation coming of age a few decades after the mutiny, that is Sepoy mutiny. The action is indicated through tense environment of mounting nationalism and separatism. Set in the context of a national debates and controversies of cultural, political and religious identity, the novel stages dialectics not between British colonialism and Indian resistance, as Western readers are accustomed to expect, but between a fiercely orthodox Hindu nationalism and the liberal Bengali reform movement within Hinduism, the Brahmo Samaj. Brahmo Samaj is a movement which profoundly believes in right to freedom, in which many good Western tendencies were also adopted. They were instrumental in wiping out national evils like Sati Pratha, Parda system, child marriage, caste system and was in favor of widow remarriages and education for women. Although these were the attempts made by British that were meant to bring reforms in Hinduism. Gora, the soft-spoken and emotional protagonist of the novel, symbolizes ideal patriotism based on the tenets of Hinduism. Orphaned after his Irish parents were killed in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, he is brought up by a Brahmin family. As a young man in search of an identity, Gora begins rather ironically to frame a self-understanding that is based on a fierce dislike for the colonizers, their culture and their religion. Patriotism for him implies identification with Hinduism. He could never understand patriotism separating it from Hinduism, but his revivalist path begins to contradict with the liberal reformist, one of the Brahmo Samaj, which gradually began to appeal to his closest friend Binoy. Tagore adeptly created that magical effect through the development of these two characters within a complex network of other sub-stories, whose protagonists intensify the novel's central tension between the parochialism of being Indian and the universality of being human. Throughout human history, the feminine gender has been portrayed as a symbol of fertility, a goddess representing the motherland, or even as a class of people whose best place is in the hearth and the home. In each of these cases, the woman is not projected as an individual like man, but as a part of every philosophy, process or function. But Tagore gives freedom to his female characters to exist individually and create a space for themselves in the society, just as the men in his novel have. Interestingly, the number of female to male characters is equal in this novel. The women who are the pillars of the narrative go through drastic transformations too. Tagore delicately balances the growth of womanhood by providing opposing examples almost like binary opposites and churning out a victor from them. He methodically plays the tunes of the individuals versus societies in his novel. Tagore defines feminism in a novel way. He provides his female characters the freedom to find a place for themselves in the face of society without hurting others. Anandamoyi and Sucharita are not causes for mighty disasters, as they lack the extreme pride, which is often the folly of larger than life characters of epics. Tagore tries to be careful by not giving superhuman powers to his female characters. Sucharita's initial hostility towards Gora is understandable. Moral cleansing is not an objective of Gora. Rather, Tagore takes care for the change in novel's people and takes most of its characters through a life journey in which they are able to discover their own personal humanity. Feminism at an accelerated pace was not tolerated by people of India at that time. Tagore published Gora in 1924, although it appears serially even earlier. It was a contemporary to the times Tagore lived in. Lolita's failure is Tagore's device to convince the feminists of Indian society that the sudden outcry for freedom and dissolution of women from Hindu society would get them very little. The little Borodishundari got from her Brahmo feministic ideology that let her wear revealing clothes and converse with men in daylight. Even this little freedom would have meant a lot for the women folk of that time, but it was not something for which one had to bring forth a cultural and social revolution. Women constituted half of Bharatavarsha, that is, India as a nation of people, as seen in the great Indian epic written by Vyasamuni. The Mahabharata presents much social, religious, political and philosophical discourses through the dynamics of a few members of a large family. Tagore does the same thing with the people or with his characters in Gora. Anandamoyi and Sucharita can be compared to Mother Kunti, for they share their zeal to bring right deeds to the forefront of matters. Just in the way Kunti hides the truth of Karna's birth, so does Anandamoyi hides Gora's lineage from her dear boy. Sucharita is adopted into the Bhattacharya family, just as Kunti was taken into King Bhoja's household. Both characters went through a name change, but their persona did not change. In the lines of Mahabharata, Sucharita is shown as an outspoken feminist, just as Draupadi was. Although the similarity of feminism exists between the two characters, there is an important difference between Draupadi and Sucharita. Draupadi is vengeful of the Kauravas, but Sucharita does not display the same streak, thanks to her training and the care and concern of Paresh Babu. She is a quieter and more humane character than Draupadi. It should be noted that Draupadi's feminism cost the lives of the Kauravas and many others, both royals and soldiers paid the heavy price. Feminism, if mishandled, can be destructive. This signal was clearly sent by Tagore. Anandamoyi and Sucharita are not causes for mighty disasters, as they lack the extreme pride which is often the folly of larger than life characters of epics. Tagore keeps himself from making his feminine players superhumans. Sucharita's initial hostility towards Gora is understandable. Lolita's badly planned girls' school is means for Tagore to prove that hasty decisions can prove very expensive. Whenever we reflect over the female characters of Tagore, the character of Sucharita, the modern young woman and a strong mind of her own, and equally at ease within and outside home, as well as Anandamoyi, or mother of the protagonist, confined only to home and yet with a liberated outlook, ready to break the traditional rules, begin to linger our mind. Gora has role models in flamboyant contemporary iconic figures of Swami Vivekananda and Brahmabandha Upadhyay. Both of them were restless spirits who were always struggling to overcome their inner contradictions. The fictionalized act of fashioning selves was a ritual during the compositional years of Tagore's major political novels. The split existing between strands of nationalism and nationalistic consciousness is recorded in almost all of them. When we try to understand the delicate fabric of nationalism through Gora, we have to understand it from different dimensions, different angles, or one should be mature enough to read the writer's mind. Gora's vow of celibacy and choice of the life of an ascetic built around his love of country, so overwhelmingly self-evident, and which draws out all his wealth and life. In his own words, "My blood, the very marrow of my bones, my sky, my light, in fact, my all." This indicates his complete sacrifice. A strong patriotic fervor is displayed for his country. The conflicts between two orthodox discourses or between the orthodox and the liberal discourses are represented in the novel through innumerable exchanges of dialogues involving mostly Gora and Haran Babu, Binoy, Sucharita, Porish Babu, Anandamoyi, providing necessary counterpoints in turn. Another perspective of the story can be in terms of an intergenerational attempt to coming to terms with the forces of westernization of the educated segment of Indian society. The multiple layers of meaning can be obtained from Gora as it centers on the cultural root of Bengal and Bengalis and the humiliation of society with the assault of the Western mode of thinking imposed by the British rule. The novel, created and serialized at the turn of 20th century, is regarded as an important milestone in the history of Indian fiction. There have been numerous attempts to interpret each move Tagore has made here. Gora is supposed to be viewed from the viewpoint of Gaur Mohan, the Irish orphan adopted by a Brahmin family amidst the mutiny of 1857. Mutiny here indicates Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. The novel can be taken as a saga of a triumph over color and caste prejudices also. On a deeper psychological level, the explicit masculinity of Gora's character is contrasted with the positive androgynous natures of Binoy and Anandamoyi. Binoy is sensitive and romantic and not at all forceful as a leader. His emotional resolves are achieved after a lot of hesitation and apprehension. His suavity at times seems somewhat effeminate in comparison to Gora's macho virile bearing. In short, there are indications of certain characteristic traits in Binoy which surfaced during the period of masculine nationalistic self and are labelled as woman-like, that is, qualities which befit the female folks. On the other hand, Gora's mother, Anandamoyi's character shows signs of robust mental strength, clarity of thought and power of differentiating customs and superstitions, and the most importantly, rigorous reasoning ability. These are all qualities which would have suited immaculately with the image of liberal male social reformer of Bengal in the 19th century. Binoy's and Anandamoyi's characters are fictional representations of the breaking down of male and female binary opposites of nationalist discourse and also projections of alternative androgyny. Tagore uses psychological realism to create a better picture of freedom. Indian novels were often platters of greater than Eastern philosophy and had little flesh and blood of the characters. But in Gora, Tagore successfully webs the life of feminism in a unique, untainted fashion. Despite Lolita's social failure, Tagore generously gives Lolita a ticket to maturity in her conversation with Anandamoyi, in which she tells Anandamoyi that it is not necessary for him to give up all that in order to establish mutual relationships with other human beings. Binoy's dilemma is clarified with Anandamoyi's help, who convinces him that there is no need to change. Thus, Binoy grasps the totality of the complex Tagore's humanism through his evolving relationship with Lolita. Tagore puts his belief in humanism in the forefront when Binoy says, if affection cannot put up with differences, then why do differences exist anywhere in the world? The event of Ghoshpara brings a sea change in Gora's thought process. Only after his unplanned interaction with the poor barber's family does Gora learn to adopt Binoy's philosophy of applying principles to people, and realizes that things are not quite same when lives are involved and not abstract like ideas. His time in the jail cell gives Gora time to reflect on himself, and strangely enough he is weighed down by same romantic disease he had accused Binoy of, that is love. The events of Nanda's death, the Muslim man and his shopping basket being knocked aside by the Brahmin cab, discrimination at Ghoshpara, and the view of rural Bengal brings forth a new face of Bharatabarsha. It is no more an idea but a complex piece of earth teeming with millions of people. Gora's foreignness is disclosed at the end of the novel. Before realizing his true identity, Gora struggles really hard to live up to his status of an upper caste pious Hindu in a society that is going through turbulent times due to the arrival of the Christian missionaries and the establishment of Brahmoism. His attempts are directed always towards bridging the gap between self and the imaginary other, which is manifested to him in the guise of the savior of his country. Gora strongly believes that the majority of events in his life were not accidental, and that they were not merely the result of his own individual wishes. He believed that his existence has a certain objective and is destined to be the ruler of the country, to lead the people in a right direction. Gora's self is not to be conceived in any conventional racial or religious categories. He is neither Hindu nor Christian, not even a non-Hindu or non-Christian. He is neither Indian nor an Irish, not even a non-Indian or a non-Irish. The narrated form of his India is the imagined community uttered by Gora himself. The true India is rich and full, and unless we take our stand there, we shall not be able to draw upon the sap of life either by our intellect or by our heart. Therefore, I say, forget everything: book learning, the illusion of titles, the temptations of servile livelihood. Renounce the attractions of all these and let us launch the ship towards its post. I, at least, can never forget the true and complete image of India. Gora is convinced that the liberation of modern India can be achieved only if people of India embrace and follow Hinduism. He has young Brahmin followers who want to oppose excessive modernism and westernization. Though Brahmo family has a modern outlook which includes rejection of idolatry and caste as outdated evils, it exemplifies a way of life which combines love and respect for India with a universalism whose attractiveness is hard to resist. The novel mirrors a vignette of the struggles faced by educated Indians in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Tagore himself was synonymous with Brahmo Samaj, but he was also sensitive to the tendencies in the Samaj towards extremities of Western and in particular excessive Christian influence. He was torn between his own nationalist loyalties and the appeal of a universal religion and culture of which a purified Hinduism might be a central part. Tagore's ideal image of India is in the reflection of Anandamoyi, the Bengali childless woman who adopts an Irish orphan during the Indian Sepoy mutiny. Gora's story starts on a bloody night when an English lady is given shelter in the cowshed of a house owned by Anandamoyi and Krishnadayal. Her Irish husband has been stabbed or murdered, and that very night she gives birth to their son and dies. The little baby is adoringly embraced by Anandamoyi. Thereafter, she brings him up as her own son with utmost care and love, and without his identity known to anyone except her husband Krishnadayal. The book does not depict Gora's childhood. Instead, it begins with his youth in colonial Calcutta. Gora gets his master's degree and becomes a staunch spokesman for Orthodox Hinduism. The story uncovers the reasoning between intense nationalism and revival of traditional Hinduism, and globalism and progressive reformation on the other. Like the Bengalis of their time, the fictional characters of Gora are all caught up in the inconsistencies of a culture in transition. In the novel, a picture of the social, political, racial and religious forces working in Bengal at the turn of the century emerges. But what is most exciting is the character of Anandamoyi, especially how this Bengali woman moves beyond the borders of both Hindu orthodoxy and Brahmo Samaj modernity, how she embodies Tagore's expansive vision of India. Tagore explores the intimate relationship between Anandamoyi and India and the intricate way in which Tagore draws Anandamoyi on the canvas of India's unique philosophical heritage. Ironically, the more closely Tagore identifies Anandamoyi with her own country, the more universal she becomes. His essential Indian infigurations lead to a configuration of India which no boundaries can contain. There is a strong aesthetic dimension to this novel, that is, use of Rasadhvani aesthetics. Tagore uses the Rasadhvani aesthetics intentionally to place Lalita, Sucharita, Binoy and Gora within the figurative framework of their prototypes in Sanskrit romantic comedy. He was well versed in Sanskrit and has written on some of the authors and individual texts. Many of his plays are based on stories taken from the major Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata. The term Rasadhvani in the title refers to Sanskrit theories of rasa and dhvani, a memory-based aesthetic concentrating on patterns of verbal, structural and figurative suggestions. The plot and the character configurations in Gora connects its reader with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice also. One might say Paresh Babu's wife is like Mrs. Bennet, though Paresh Babu is nothing like Mr. Bennet. Or one could say Gora is like Darcy and Binoy is like Bingley. Despite being a political novel, it can be categorized as a romantic comedy, very similar to Shakespeare and Jane Austen's romantic comedies. In Gora, the marriage and love plot is significantly linked to the politics of ideological revisionism in the context of colonial India. We have come to the end of the analysis of this novel titled Gora, written by Tagore. You must have already learnt that he has touched upon many complex issues of life, nationalism and humanity as whole. I am sure you have understood the intricacies of these issues and enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you.